Terrific. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Criminal Law as a Tool of Authoritarian Control speaker series. My name is Katie Naples Mitchell. I'm the moderator of this series. And today's topic is on police power in building authoritarian and social control. Thank you all so much for being here. Just a reminder that we have another event next week in the series on November 5th, same time, same place, on the development of police in the US, suppressing and stoking racial and class conflicts. With Professor Julian Go. And I want to just give some kind of foundation for how we operate these meetings, these events in the series. We want this to feel as engaged as possible. We encourage people to use the Q&A and the chat throughout the conversation so that you're able to share resources, share articles that you've read on the topic, ask questions, and we will keep a running queue of the questions in the order in which we receive them, both from the chat and from the Q&A in the Zoom webinar function. And at the end, we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for questions and encourage you to unmute and ask your own question. So stick around for that if you're able to. I think the only other thing to mention is that the series is being recorded, as you can tell from the recording in progress notification, and we will be putting the video on our website and on our YouTube channel, and I will drop links to those in the chat. We are really delighted today to have speaker Stuart Schrader here. Stuart is an associate professor of history and the director of the Chloe Center for the Critical Study of Racism, Immigration, and Colonialism at Johns Hopkins University. He is the author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing from the University of California Press in 2019. And also the forthcoming book, Blue Power, How Police Organize to Protect and Serve Themselves, which is coming through Basic Books next year. Welcome, Stuart. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to get started today kind of picking up a theme that we explored with our speakers 2 weeks ago at our last session. It might be useful to give some theoretical underpinnings for your work. And so like we talked about in our last session, we spoke about borders and this sort of negative feedback loop in the use of the rhetoric of war, both domestically and internationally, for a crime control and social control agenda. And you've written about how the US sort of organizes itself politically as an agent of global power by violating the sanctity of borders politically and ideologically, but also enacting policies meant to make the US's own borders seemingly impenetrable, right? And enforcing those borders aggressively. So I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about what you mean by this and how you see police forces as sort of key constituent elements of US national sovereignty or national sovereignty more broadly.
Sure. Well, one of the key differences between the military and the police in the United States, as well as in other countries, is that the military tends to be celebrated, memorialized, honored. Its history tends to be well known and documented. Even when military engages in abhorrent violations of human rights or international law, there's kind of an expectation that oversight will prevail. In contrast, the police, as a historian named Alfred McCoy has suggested, police historically have not tended to be celebrated or commemorated. The idea of police as kind of heroes, the way that we tend to think of soldiers as heroes, is a relatively recent invention. The kind of societal honor and celebration of police in the United States is relatively recent. It was the result of a political project, which we can discuss as we proceed. But it really came to the fore in the aftermath of the Cold War and certainly after 9/11 and the kind of transformation of the civic sphere. The police, have a much longer history of operating at, what somebody like Ralph Ellison would have called the lower frequencies of society. They're kind of in the muck among the social outcasts, the sort of, quote unquote, dregs of society. A history of police tends to be forgotten. And for historians like me, accessing archival records of police is quite difficult. They tend to be much less accessible, or even much less even kept and and made available than the archives of the military. So you have this kind of contrast, but at the same time, no sort of mainstream theorist of modern political or social life would kind of question the necessity of the police power. Whether we go back all the way to somebody like Aristotle, who kind of comes up with a certain kind of definition of what comes to be known as the police power with people like Adam Smith and William Blackstone in the 1700s. It's considered sort of like fundamental, this kind of protective sense of regulating and protecting society is fundamental. Uh, in the 19th century, with the rise of capitalism, we get the police institution, which is different from the much more long-standing, tradition of a police activity in philosophy. So police as an institution come to be the bearers of this responsibility for kind of managing social life under capitalism. And they're vested with this kind of internal power to regulate the sort of social maelstrom of modernity, industrialization, capitalism, and so forth. Um, so, it's considered, it's just considered, something that we don't even question. It's just sort of, police are there. So this is the kind of internal purpose of police. Again, generally not really celebrated, but goes without saying that it exists, in contrast to the military, which is external, celebrated, right? So what starts to happen in the 20th century for the United States is and also for other countries, and it's sort of wrapped up in the history of colonialism and imperialism, is that the police, which have this sort of hidden internal role, start to export their expertise, their techniques. And police in the global north start to legitimize themselves, oftentimes through their abilities to share and export their expertise, their knowledge. Police in the global south come to legitimize themselves through their role as recipients of this expertise. And so this starts to, sort of transform the relationship where police agencies are no longer solely operating at these lower frequencies. They're operating across borders. That becomes part of their image and starts to be more celebrated. However, the history of the 20th century and this sharing of police expertise, I'm teaching a class about the Cold War right now, and I was just talking with my students about this. In places like Guatemala, and other places in Latin America where the United States helped develop police forces, they turn into these kind of ruthless tools of authoritarian regimes. And what ensues from that is people fleeing state violence. So of course it's a complicated history, but ultimately people start fleeing and trying to get to the United States to try to leave places where the United States has helped install these these kind of police forces that have all of the kind of modern capabilities of surveillance and political repression and so forth. And people flee and they get to borders that are increasingly impenetrable to them. And so it's just to say that there's a complicated relationship between police and military that we can continue to talk about. There's a complicated relationship between police as internal originally and then increasingly external. And I think, just to get to the title of our event today, we need to be thinking about this in terms of its consequences for authoritarianism.
Yeah, I really appreciate that framing. And the series, we've spoken with some experts on Latin America in earlier iterations of this, and the kind of history in particular. You talked about Guatemala. We've talked about it in terms of El Salvador with other speakers like Naomi Ariaza, and seeing those same themes. And I think, this brings us perfectly into kind of the next question, which is putting sort of a finer point on the research in your book, that is the borders, right? And thinking about a very specific period in which this was national policy in the US, right? To do this kind of exporting of policing through kind of technical assistance and building up police agencies in other countries. So I'm wondering if you can give us some of that history of these specific federal projects in the 1960s and 70s, connecting public safety grants and police training back to a domestic agenda here, but through exporting this as sort of a good in a certain way, a good and service. how did these federal projects work? How did they come about? And what kind of ended up stopping this project? And how does that history sort of foreground our current moment and thinking about the Cold War politics and now our current kind of geopolitics?
Sure. Yeah, in Badges Without Borders, I focus on a small but important um, agency called the Office of Public Safety, which was housed within the Agency for International Development. And it had some predecessors to it in the 1950s, but the Agency for International Development comes into existence around 1962, and the Office of Public Safety with it. And um, it has some shadowy connections to CIA, uh, but mostly what it is a technical assistance operation where leading police figures, the types of people who in the United States taught at colleges where there were police training programs, types of people who wrote in the professional literature, wrote articles, wrote textbooks, etc. Not all of them, but for the most part, there were a few hundred of these police experts who, some of them were just kind of like retired cops who were looking for adventure, but some of them were really kind of like the cream of the crop in terms of police expertise at the time, and they generally would go on these advisory missions overseas and engage in technical assistance, help setting up crime laboratories, telecommunications systems, et cetera, et cetera. And 52 countries about in the 1960s into the early 1970s received this type of technical assistance. Some of the programs lasted for quite a long time. Guatemala, for example, lasted from the 50s into the 70s. And some of them were shorter. And the Office of Public Safety also operated a training academy in Washington, D.C. called the International Police Academy, um, which received police from something like 77 countries around the globe. And these tended to be high-ranking officials. And the idea would be that they would take the lessons they learned, some of which were kind of basic forensics, and some of them were more sort of intelligence-oriented, um, explicitly counterinsurgency, counter-subversion oriented projects. Although I argue in the book that we shouldn't draw too sharp a distinction between kind of regular policing and counterinsurgency. That's one of the takeaways of the book. But anyway, the classes sometimes had different labels. So thousands of police at high ranks would go back home, and they would be responsible for kind of disseminating the training that they received in the United States. The third piece that the Office of Public Safety oversaw, the most expensive piece, was supplying materials to police around the globe, ranging from things like radios, automobiles or motorcycles, and then of course weapons, tear gas, guns, etc. So this program was again, it was relatively small, but it had a really large impact. It was estimated that something like 1 million police around the globe were touched by either the materials or the technical assistance or the training in the course of its operation, and it really was designed to help reform or professionalize policing in other countries. And many of the police experts who were advisors in the Office of Public Safety, they had experienced the kind of reform and professionalization process in their home cities where they had been cops. They came from cities across the United States, and many of these places, they also had to upgrade their police. They didn't have very advanced telecommunications systems. A lot of officers weren't necessarily using automobile patrol, et cetera, et cetera. So they experienced some of those transformations in their own careers, and were kind of evangelists for those transformations overseas. The program ran until 1974, 1975, when it was shut down by Congress amid accusations of human rights abuses, including torture on the part of the police who were receiving this U.S. aid. And so it was shut down. The academy in Washington, D.C. was closed. And it was really actually, I would say, a victory for the kind of anti-war, anti-imperialist movement. It was at the same time as the anti-war movement gained a lot of traction around the war in Vietnam. But the understanding was, of course, there was police assistance happening in Vietnam, but it was happening in all these other countries as well. And so, activists worked with people in Congress to get it shut down, and they succeeded. Um, However, the war on drugs ensued immediately, and when they wrote the legislation shutting down the Office of Public Safety, they said, well, there's going to be a couple of exceptions where these operations can continue, and counter narcotics was one of them. And so that some of the, a lot of these guys, who are advisors overseas, they came back home. Some of them went back into law enforcement domestically. Some of them came to work for the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was a kind of domestic analog of the Office of Public Safety created by the 1968 crime bill, to fight the war on crime. It really did something very similar to the Office of Public Safety in the sense that it disseminated resources and expertise from Washington around the country in the same way that OPS did that around the globe. But some of them, some of the advisors stayed overseas, and they changed the sign on their door. It said, previously it would say something like, um, Office of Public Safety, uh, police assistance, whatever. And now the sign would say some other agency, counter narcotics, whatever. And they kind of like kept doing the same type of work they were doing, which was again generally organized around counterinsurgency. There was no question from day one when even before the OPS was established, when they first started doing police assistance, the State Department officials who were kind of thinking about this project, intelligence officials who were thinking about it, they were just like, well, we're not just training police for the sake of training police. We're training them in order to control communist subversion and prevent communist revolution around the globe. And that was what they did.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I know one of the things that you talked about being unique to this and then kind of being replicated, like you said, in those law enforcement grants domestically was the kind of devolution to localities, right, of the discretion on how to fulfill those grants,
Yeah.
right, because they were these sort of block grants. And I'm interested in that too, and thinking about we're currently in a federal government shutdown, right? And thinking about how the power of the purse ends up influencing, right, how localities take up these kinds of federal goals that, as you say, are kind of tied into national sovereignty.
Yeah. It's interesting because the block grant arguably was really formalized and test driven and formalized in the context of criminal justice. Ultimately, it comes to be used in many other policy spheres, but the idea behind the block grant is basically to give relatively unrestricted funds so that people at a kind of more local level have a say over how it's used, rather than the kind of bureaucrats in Washington. Well, we don't have very many of those anymore, but nevertheless, that's the idea. Is like people in Washington don't know how, what the best needs, the best way to fulfill the needs of local communities, um, how to do that, and therefore we should give the authority to the local officials. Now, what was interesting about the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration was that they kind of knew that they being Republicans in Congress and conservative Democrats too, they kind of knew that there was a risk of if you gave too much local control, you might have sort of progressive mayors who might have a say over how to use these funds. So they vested a lot of control in governors, and they sort of trusted that governors would be a bit more conservative in the way that they doled out the funds. But nevertheless, one thing that I think is really crucial to know about this, sort of policy instrument was that on the one hand, at the very outset, after the 1968 crime bill was signed, was that a lot of money went into riot control. Obviously in 1968, the bill was passed in the immediate aftermath of the unrest after the assassination of King, and so there was great fear of further political or unrest, political protest, rebellion, urban unrest, etc. So they fast tracked a lot of money and materials for the purposes of riot control, and then also money went into things like surveillance and intelligence gathering tools, including computerized data management. So, Washington in that sense did kind of put its thumb on the scale in terms of like what it wanted to make sure that police were able to do. And I would just also note, one thing that I talk about that's a kind of crucial piece of Badges Without Borders is that the guy who is the director of the Office of Public Safety, whose name is Byron Engel, he testified before the Kerner Commission. He was really close with an official who worked in federal law enforcement and also worked for the Kerner Commission. And they kind of collaborated to make sure that some of his recommendations about riot control and about the dissemination of riot control, certain types of riot control technologies, would actually happen. And so he really, and he justified his arguments about this, about the best ways to engage in riot control, by saying, look, we have all this experience doing this all over the globe in Latin America and Asia and so forth. And so let's do it back home. So yeah, the outcome of that was really intensified repressive capabilities of police. And then after that, there was sort of a decade-long massive infusion of federal funds for reform and upgrading of police that followed that. And I would just make one small note, which is to say that like through the block grant structure, they weren't trying to pay salaries of police. That was considered kind of anathema. The idea was, again, like if Washington is paying the paycheck, then Washington can have a say over how police operate. And police chiefs were really worried about this because not just the sort of fear of the anonymous, bureaucrat in Washington, but actually fear that civil rights enforcement would constrain what police were able to do. So salaries weren't being paid except under certain circumstances when it was a kind of new experimental program for new types of policing operations. And it
Yeah.
wasn't really until 1994 with the giant 1994 crime bill, which is much bigger, or the next very big crime bill, when salaries start directly getting paid by Washington. And that is like marks a real shift, I think.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And this archival research that you did for the book required you kind of digging in two separate buckets, right? And sort of like knitting together this history in a particular way. And so one of the things that, particularly so much of our conversations in this series have been looking at the way that policies sort of get offered in one domain and then implemented in another domain, and then there ends up being this kind of game of leapfrog of seeing the way that these things play out again and again in new contexts, and both abroad and domestically. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you were able to knit those stories together of looking at both the kind of funding of these international grants, and then also the way that this manifested in kind of the domestic sphere, and that how those bureaucratic histories tell us something about the way that these things developed both in parallel and in dialogue.
Yeah, I was interested in the notion that there was some kind of exchange or transfer between foreign and domestic spheres, and perhaps even military and civilian spheres. But when you go to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, for example, if you want to look at the civilian archives, you go this way. If you want to look at the military archives, you go this way. They're really separate rooms, separate archivists. So if you go in and you say, I want to look at the place where they meet, the answer generally from the archivist is going to be like, well, they don't. But some of those individuals I mentioned, Byron Engel, the other guy whose name is Arnold Saglin, who was his collaborator, who worked for the Kerner Commission. What happened was that as I was doing some of this research, and I was trying to look on kind of both sides of that divide, the civilian and the military, or the foreign and the domestic. I noticed that some of those names, literally those two names in particular, and then some others were popping up on both sides. Byron Engel is appearing before the Kerner Commission. Arnold Saglin is a staff member of the Kerner Commission, charged with investigating why the unrest in the summer of 1967 occurred and what to do about it to prevent it from happening again. Um, and then they're also appearing, readily in the records of the Agency for International Development, where Engel was employed. So, you know, I still kind of in some sense marvel at the kind of stroke of luck that I had, which is honestly the first time I saw, those names in two places. I remembered them and I was like, that name sounds familiar. Where did I see it before? And like, why did I see it before? And then that kind of you know, set me on that pathway. But if I had just not been paying attention and I didn't notice the names in two surprising, two places where it was surprising to see them both places, maybe the whole project never would have happened. So, there was a little bit of just kind of serendipity and contingency, um, which allowed me to then put together an archive that was, it was not pre-given. It did not exist. I really had to put it together. Luckily, Saglin, he had personal papers that he had left behind. Engel left nothing but his official, not even official papers, but papers of the Office of Public Safety. There's nothing that's his own personal papers to be found. So, I had to go to lots of different places. I went, there are a lot of federal archives or national archives sources, but then, even I went to some small towns. There was a story, a kind of famous anecdote, which was that somebody, said like, you know, what are we doing sending these cops from, kind of like exurbs. They didn't use the word exurbs, but exurbs in the Bay Area. Like, what the hell are we doing sending these cops from like Walnut Creek to South Vietnam? And I was like, was that a figure of speech or is that true that it was actually like cops from Walnut Creek? And so I went to Walnut Creek, which is now a quite, fancy town, in the Bay Area. And I went to the municipal archive and I tried to, which was open basically like 2 hours a week, once a week. And so I tried to figure out the reality of whether it was true that some cops from Walnut Creek ended up in South Vietnam, and it was true, and they brought their buddies with them, and so it was not an easy process, but uh, ultimately it was quite rewarding.
Yeah, well, and I think something that's so interesting in that particular vista into the project, right, is thinking about these sort of um, otherwise not necessarily known, but functionally national figures, right, who were in charge of these big government
Hmm.
agencies, who then are having these kind of tentacle effects, right, of people from small towns and other parts of the country then being sent on these massive
Yeah.
missions. But that the way that you could kind of piece it together, right, was by following the particular career trajectories of certain individuals who had kind of amassed this particular kind of quiet power, right? And so I think that that is a potentially useful lesson also for the current moment of thinking about the way that people in um, who obtain spheres of influence in their particular domain, right, end up then being able to grow in that power, obtain more power over time, and also obtain other spheres of influence, right? Thinking about even in the current kind of federal administration, right, the way that
Yeah.
Tom Homan, who started under the Obama administration, now it has a much bigger, broader role carrying out a broader project on the same theme under the Trump administration, right? And
Yeah.
I don't know if that feels like a useful parallel, but it strikes me as thinking about the ways that unique individuals can play a pretty outsized role in shaping federal policy and international development, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that it is really true that, some time overseas gives people's voices a lot of credibility. And Yeah, I mean, like somebody like Joe Arpaio, who's a, sheriff in um, Arizona for a really, really long time, and ultimately, ended up kind of in Trump world, and Trump pardoned him or whatever. He was running in some of the same circles as some of the figures I write about. It's like these people oftentimes tend to stick around for a really, really long time, and again they burnish their credentials through overseas experience or um, experience at the border, which I think is on a lot of our minds these days. But the kind of myth making that people are able to do about their own experience, it's somewhat enhanced by saying like, you know, I went to this like place where things were really bad, whether it's the border or whatever, Latin America, uh, the Middle East, etc. This is a kind of recurring theme for a lot of these officials. And I would argue that they oftentimes are very conscious of trying to replicate the experience that they have had. So, even if they're going back to, in the case of public safety advisors, they're going back to, a small town in, whatever state, Maryland, for example, they will they'll say, I went back to be the police chief, but I never forgot my time in Saigon. And it's like sometimes it's a little bit hard to interpret what they mean, but certainly that is, again, it's how they gain their credibility.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think one of the other themes that you talk about in the book, right, is how, and we've been talking about this sort of in broad strokes, but how the project of counterinsurgency in these Cold War countries also was sort of recapitulated domestically, right, and thinking about suppressing leftist organizing and the anti-war movement and
Yeah.
movements for racial justice and Black Power. And I wonder if you could kind of put a finer point for us on thinking about that relationship between counterinsurgency and domestic policing, and in particular the idea of community policing,
Yeah.
right? Like how do you see those as connected ideologically?
Well, there's a kind of discourse about counterinsurgency and urban warfare that arises in the 1990s, a kind of post-Cold War, sort of like geopolitical analysis, military analysis, which is like, okay, what are the coming threats that, the US might have to deal with? And, urban warfare comes to be one of these themes that a lot of resources are spent on trying to figure out what to do. And there's both kind of like left and right explanations for why this might be happening, but ultimately, the military gets very interested in it. And there's this one article that comes out kind of early on in this discourse where they say, well, look, like if we want to think about how to solve the problem of instability and the kind of chaos of growing, megacities, uh, well, just look at what they did in New York City, where they have been able to, sort of solve the crime problem, because in essence, over the course of the 1990s, after reaching a really intense peak in terms of rates of violent crime started to decline quite precipitously over the course of the 1990s, and a lot of credit went to the NYPD, went to figures like Bill Bratton, who were associated with to some degree, community policing. I mean, which I think is, I always say it's like community policing is like one of the hardest to define terms because it uses two really vague terms. Like, what are we actually talking about when we say community or police or policing? But so you put them together, and it's sometimes it's kind of like in the eye of the beholder. But certainly for Bratton, it was a very kind of numbers oriented approach to policing, data oriented, and the NYPD really ran with that. But I do think that fundamentally the other key piece is that it was informed by the quote unquote broken windows theory elaborated by Kelling and Wilson and in The Atlantic in 1982 originally. And the idea, therefore, in that argument, in the broken windows argument, is controlling low level disorder is the way to prevent more serious disorder. And what I argue in Badges Without Borders, I mean, this is not a central argument in the book, but it is one key piece, is just to say that like, um, the broken windows, the way it get that idea, the way it gets picked up subsequently and then sort of reinfuses counterinsurgency theory, overlooks the way that counterinsurgency theory back in the 1960s and 70s was uh, trying to come up with a very similar set of solutions. And in fact, the kind of idea of controlling sort of like low-level disorder um, became a key plank in the way that counterinsurgency theory was developing, particularly around the Rand Corporation. And they came up with a term called something like cost benefit, counterinsurgency. The idea was impose costs on people who are, disorderly or engaging in acts that are tantamount to insurgency. And that will get them to behave the way you want them to behave. And the implicit in this is a repudiation of the quote unquote hearts and minds idea. And I think that the broken windows argument is really very similar. It is very much a neoconservative argument. It's a repudiation of the kind of like great society liberal notion that there are social causes of crime that can be dealt with through social means, rather than primarily through police means. So the point is that this kind of like pendulum swing from underlying causes to dealing with effects primarily has happened in debates around counterinsurgency, certainly in the context of the war in Vietnam, and then it infuses debates around policing subsequently, and then it comes back into counterinsurgency. And so I think it's beneficial to sort of see this back and forth movement rather than I think constantly sort of reinventing the wheel, which I think and obviously I get it. Intellectuals want to claim that they invented something new that is helpful for their careers, but in fact these debates come and go, and they move from the foreign policy sphere to the domestic sphere and back and forth. And so I think that it's not just a question of intellectual history. I think it's also a question, if we want to understand why certain types of policy solutions don't actually work, it's like, well, look at how they were tried before and what happened.
Yeah, that's really helpful to think through. And I think kind of leads us well into the next sort of pivot for where I want us to go and sort of setting up your next book, is thinking about how police define themselves, right? And you've written about this, and in particular, I'll share a piece in the chat about in the New Republic that you wrote after the murder of George Floyd in 2020 about how there are some of these sustaining myths of policing, right? That police do not lie, that they are civilian peacekeepers, that they are guided by law and policy and democratically accountable, that you see these as sort of instrumental political arguments for policing as an institution, right? In a way to justify and legitimate police power. And I wonder if we could speak a little bit more about this as sort of a contested vision of the role of police, right? There's one argument, I think, deeply held and authentically believed by some people in policing institutions, that police are the thin blue line, right, standing between order and chaos. And then I think there's a more critical view, about the way that these myths actually foster police power in ways that are sort of antithetical to an ultimate goal of safety. Can you give us some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that fundamentally what we should be concerned with and considering is the way that these types of arguments are political arguments. They're political claims. And the reason I think it's important to think in those terms is that if we don't if we think of them as apolitical and neutral, we run the risk of thinking that when police deviate from them, for example, one of the ones you mentioned, that police are a civilian institution. Obviously, there's been a lot of criticism. I myself was motivated by this criticism in some of my research that police have become militarized. They are donning, military gear. They're engaging in operations that seem to be more oriented toward an enemy rather than kind of protection of the community, et cetera, right? So we see these deviations from what we understand as this kind of like neutral apolitical norm, which is police are civilian, not military. And so then we engage in projects that try to reform the and eradicate the deviation. So, okay, police shouldn't drive armored trucks except under extraordinary circumstances. Police should carry pistols and rifles, but not, semi-automatic weapons, whatever. Like you can just like imagine a million configurations of the way where you might want to reform something to get it back to what you understand to be the kind of like neutral norm of the way things are supposed to operate. Um, and then those reforms pretty much inevitably fail, right? And why do they fail? And there's many reasons why they fail. But if we had understood the original claim that police themselves are making as a political argument in order to achieve certain types of political ends, then we might be less susceptible to thinking that like this is actually a standard or a norm that needs to be upheld, and we need to just like do some reform, tinkering in order to get back to where it should have been. Instead, if we treat it as a kind of political argument, we I think are more likely to not fall into that trap and see some of the resistance to reform as a itself a political act and a political deflection of other types of public demands from elected officials, whatever. It's there's political contestation happening. It's not just this kind of like neutral sort of tinkering of a machine where you just need to calibrate the nuts and bolts correctly, and then everything will just work smoothly.
Yeah, and that idea of sort of like police taking up space in the public realm in a political framework, I think is really sort of essential for your next project.
Yeah.
Right. And so for your forthcoming book, Blue Power, How Police Organize to Protect and Serve Themselves, you return to sort of the same period, right, in the 1960s and 70s, but looking at a really separate archive.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could tell us, like, what got you interested in writing this book, and how did this sort of history of police unions across the country, develop into a concentration of power for the police?
Well, Badges Without Borders talks about the kind of apex of the professionalization movement, the moment when this became kind of the widely accepted dogma among police to the point that it was, spread all over the globe as gospel. At the same time, there was a kind of what we might call insurgency within the police institution itself against the leaders of the kind of professionalization movement. It was seen to be by rank and file police, it was seen to be this kind of top-down imperative imposed on police by management. They didn't have much say in it. They didn't like what it entailed. They didn't like being forced to take college classes or, even, for example, take, racial sensitivity training. They didn't like having their patrol routines changed. So, for example, one massive problem for police in the 1950s and 60s was that cops largely wanted to work at times when crime was not likely to occur, right? Everybody sort of knew that crime was most likely to occur at night, and reformers were like, well, that's when we should have the shifts occur, and so they reorganized officers' schedules, and officers really didn't like that. I mean, obviously, it's understandable if I was suddenly told, well, you have to work at night instead of during the day. I might be upset too. Um, but that was like a professionalizing reform. It's like, oh, let's be kind of like evidence-based about how we do this. They didn't, use that term. That's a more recent vintage term, but um, you know, that was a management decision. So at the same time, you also have the civil rights movement. You have Supreme Court decisions that are changing how police are supposed to deal with criminal suspects, the rights of defendants, et cetera. The kind of strengthening of Fourth Amendment protections and so forth. So a lot of rank and file police really felt like they were um, under the thumb of management. They were being controlled by liberal Supreme Court justices. They were being accused of heinous activities by civil rights protesters, and so they started to organize themselves. And this was the moment when public sector unionism was really taking off in the 1960s. Basically many states started passing laws that allowed for public sector unionization, and police, took advantage of this. And so what I trace in the book is going from the late 1960s, basically all the way up until the present. But I concentrate, I spend a lot of time on the early period of the 60s and 70s because it's really a quite fascinating moment when police unions are, really coming into existence as kind of in the mold of labor unions. A lot of these organizations pre-existed as kind of social clubs, but they really start to engage in collective bargaining. They start collecting dues, et cetera. They start gaining grievance procedures. These are the key requisites for unions. Any union would have all of those prerequisites. So police start to do this, and they start to try to wrestle back some control over their working conditions. They try to improve their compensation. And perhaps most importantly, they really try to resist a growing effort to rein in abuses by police. There is a lot of concern about corruption. There's a lot of concern about racist police violence, police brutality. There's interest in civilian oversight or civilian review. And unions become this vehicle on the one hand of trying to deal with the working conditions, but on the other hand of dealing with the kind of political conditions being imposed, again, of oversight, of internal affairs investigations, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I trace this history in the new book, and one key piece of it is this question that faced police at the time, which was, are we part of organized labor? Are we part of the labor movement, or are we doing something different? And there were, differing opinions among police officers. And I think ultimately, the answer, not to like give away what's in the book that hasn't even been published yet, but ultimately, I think everybody kind of knows that like they didn't really become part of the labor movement. But I show how that debate sort of unfolded and what were some of the key hinge moments at which there was a kind of decision that some of these police unions had to make about which way they were going to go. Were they going to side with, organized labor? Was organized labor going to invite them in, or would there be distance? And some of this debate still persists all the way up until the present. There are still some police unions that are affiliated with the AFL-CIO, and there have been, particularly after 2020, there were concerted efforts by activists, within some of the unions to push out police from the international, but they didn't succeed.
Yeah, and I think I think you're right that there is probably a lot of understanding among our attendees about those dynamics, but I just want to put a slightly more explicit kind of linking of the concepts, right? Of like, there are people in leftist activist circles, right, who think, policing fundamentally is class opposed to the kind of interests of workers more broadly, right? That police are often tasked with enforcing capital and sort of protecting capital in the kind of like post-industrial context. And so, that those interests, that while wage and hour ideas may be important and shared values among both sets of constituencies, that really fundamentally the role of policing is sort of antithetical to some of the other broader kind of class and racial justice politics behind organized labor. Is that anything that you would add
Yeah,
to that?
absolutely. And I would just say that, at the outset of these debates in the 1960s, people, famous labor leaders like, Meany, for example, they were very explicit about this. They were like, aren't cops usually the guys who are like beating us up when we go on strike? Why would we want to why would we want to invite these guys into our into our meeting halls and so forth? So there was a strong effort mounted by a number of officials to try to convince labor leaders that police should be considered part of the labor movement. Um, but there were also other police leaders who were like, we don't need to be part of the labor movement, but we can learn from them. So on the one hand, they're publicly kind of repudiating organized labor, in public, but then in private, they're like going to their seminars, like and learning how to, how to negotiate at the bargaining table, how to get your preferred candidate elected, right? So I document a lot of this in the book and this kind of sort of difference between the some of the public rhetoric and the private tactical maneuvering that some of these police union leaders are engaging in.
Yeah, terrific. I have more questions prepared, but I also want to honor the audience participation component. So I'm going to pause on that and begin to go to the queue. I think our first question is from Cynthia Conti Cook. Conti, I'm going to try to allow you to speak so that you can unmute and ask your question directly, which you should be able to do now.
Hey, thank you. Um, Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Stuart. Wonderful conversation, and I appreciate and really love the nerd out around LEAA and the 1968 federal grants. My question is just sort of whether you also looked at that in its dynamic with the Supreme Court decisions that were newly scrutinizing local police conduct, with the extension of constitutional scrutiny to the states and to local police, and in particular to the wiretapping and how the sort of like map and cats extension of scrutiny happened the same year as the federal grants, and just how you place the chronology of all of that, as well as the how should I say? We know Earl Warren wore many hats. He is very well remembered, right, for the civil rights legacy and for the ways that the court scrutinized police more and protected civil rights. But at the same time, he was also a master architect of the ways that the law can justify and legalize um, government misconduct, and
Yeah.
mass violations of human rights. So I'd just be really curious to hear how you think about that dynamic of like the Warren Court, and Katz and the 1968 federal grant and LEIA and all of those conversations.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, it is a somewhat complicated history, and I can't say that I dealt with all of it in my work. I mean, the 1968 crime bill is an omnibus bill. It has a lot of different parts, and there were, real there was a lot of political sort of horse trading that went into crafting the bill. It really Johnson himself, he said something like it was the worst bill he ever signed, but he felt like he had no choice. I would argue he did have a choice, but the one of the it's remembered for creating the LEAA mostly, but it also did really change rules on wiretapping as well. And I think that had significant consequences for civil liberties going forward. Um, but again, that was not something that I was able to focus on too directly in my work. One piece that I do, focus on a bit is the decision that allows stop and frisk, which is the Terry v. Ohio decision. And I think that what's really interesting about that decision is that in terms of how police perceived it at the time, is that it came in this series, as I mentioned, this series of decisions that were seen to be protecting the rights of defendants. And so at first, when the Terry decision came out, um, which allow creates this new category of reasonable suspicion, which is for a stop, which is lower than probable cause for an arrest. Police are worried. They're like, is this actually going to be beneficial to us? And it falls to a number of police leaders, the type of people who I look at in the work, as well as some conservative legal scholars, who are basically like, look, guys, this is great because, and it also really fits with the sort of like professionalizing thrust that the law enforcement profession has been going through. It's just to say, like, look, now police can say, trust us. We are professionals and we know what we're doing when we engage in this type of stop that the Supreme Court has authorized. And so police come to be convinced that this is now a very powerful tool in their armamentarium. And it also, has a kind of elective affinity with this discourse of professionalism that I talk about a lot in the book. And I really do think that this now, of course, stop and frisk was already happening, and there were a number of states that had implemented stop and frisk laws and policies, but then it gets the blessing of the Supreme Court, in at the same time as vagrancy laws basically being outlawed by the Supreme Court, and so. The cops lose certain types of abilities and they gain other types of abilities, and they come to, really make great use of it.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to offer, and I dropped a link to this in the chat, that I think there's been a lot of writing about the ways in which Terry, while being theoretically a bulwark against police misconduct, right, an effort to create some kind of standard that would allow defendants to protect their rights to just being stopped arbitrarily on the street. That ultimately it has, I think, been passed with the sort of like critical legal scholarship as having been this real erosion of people's rights that has ultimately targeted exclusively Black and brown communities, and sort of like the Fourth Amendment doesn't exist in the same way in neighborhoods that are saturated by police. And I think the point that I wanted to add on that, and Anna Lvovsky has written about this extensively, that this creates, in talking about sort of police training and professional expertise, right, that this creates sort of judicial presumption of police expertise, because police officers get up on the stand and they defend these stops and say, based on my training and experience, I know this behavior to be associated with this kind of criminal act or this kind of suspicion, right? And that creates this sort of cumulative impression on judges that then decide, going forward, we're going to see that kind of behavior as being suspicious. And so we get these sort of terms of art, like blading one's body, or meaning like shielding part of their body, right? Which our state courts have sometimes taken to task, or, fidgeting becomes, or nervous behavior becomes, furtive movements, right? We see those kinds of things a lot. Exactly. Conti just put that in the chat. So, yeah. So, I think that point is really well taken.
Yeah, and I think it also is really, I think, on a lot of people's minds, given right now the way that ICE and CBP are operating in cities, and I mean, so much of this discussion, people have been using the term Kavanaugh stop to describe the stops that the immigration authorities are engaging in, that that were kind of Kavanaugh explained why they were okay. And, on the one hand, it relies on some decisions in the 1970s around immigration enforcement, but also they really rely on the framework that Terry created. And, I still think still think that constitutional rights are being violated. Nevertheless, despite Kavanaugh's reasoning, far be it for me to disagree with a Supreme Court justice, but nevertheless, however you interpret it, we can see what's happening on the street, which is that like lots and lots of people are getting chased or arrested, purely based on skin color.
Yeah, thank you for that. We are still absolutely taking questions in the chat or in the Q&A if folks want to add them. But in the meantime, I think that leads us really well into one of the other things that I had prepped for us to talk about, which is, the way that we're seeing these kinds of connections between counterinsurgency and so-called crime control and racial politics and sort of federal deployments as more visible and frankly visceral than in years past too, right? That, I wonder what as a historian of policing in the 60s, right, where the federal government was really often playing a very different role of civil rights enforcement. Now we're seeing sort of the opposite, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if you could kind of speak about those dynamics and does this shift mark something new, or does this sort of build on an existing foundation of federal power? Like, how do you conceptualize
Yeah.
this as a
Yeah.
historian?
It's definitely both. On the one hand, I do think we should see the kind of operations that ICE and CBP and even other federal agencies, the U.S. Park Police, for example, in D.C. I mean, they've become ICE in a sense, and they're engaging in um, immigration enforcement, et cetera. But these agencies are effectively engaging in what we might refer to as counterinsurgency, because I do think that um, their kind of definition of the problem to be solved and the means that they need to access in order to solve the problem, really fits within a kind of threat assessment paradigm that counterinsurgency gives us. But yeah, as you say, this is different from the period of, the kind of ramping up of the war on crime. On the one hand, you know, ICE and CBP obviously didn't exist. There were, real intense concerns in Congress and the White House, in police departments, about too much federal intervention. That this would be authoritarian. Now, of course, at the micro scale of the individual stop, police engaged in a million acts of authoritarianism on a daily basis in the 1960s, continuing up to the present. But nevertheless, the argument, certainly in the context of the Cold War, was that we the United States need to distinguish ourselves from the authoritarian regimes that we're opposed to. I think. Um, even to the degree that the Trump administration does engage in some fear mongering about, authoritarianism in some places, like Venezuela, for example, there is no real check on, kind of like macro ideological check on the, federal government engaging in just like rampant authoritarianism right now. And I think that's what we're seeing. It is different. I mean, I do think that there's a long history of INS doing all kinds of raids over its history, and then it ultimately gets rebranded and reconfigured with the creation of Department of Homeland Security. Um, but I don't think we really have any precedent for the type of activity that's going on in places like Chicago. Um, Portland, et cetera, and you name the city where it's going to come next. That I think we're all kind of waiting with bated breath to see um, where it will continue to expand, after what we've seen in LA and Chicago.
Thank you for that. We've got two questions from anonymous attendees, so I will ask on your behalf, folks. The first one, do you have any recommended readings besides your own upcoming book for community organizers or civilian oversight proponents who are frequently losing the arguments to local law enforcement employee associations when we are before local governing authorities like city councils or county supervisors? And I thank you in advance.
Um, yeah, there is a really good, and unfortunately now I can't remember the name, but there's a really good pamphlet. It's like longer than a pamphlet. It's kind of like a booklet, about um, how police unions work, how they operate, kind of like internal uh, mechanisms through which they're able to get what they want. That's really designed for organizers and activists to try to work against police union power. And maybe if I have a second, I will try to find the name and try to put it in the chat.
That's great. Um, and I will just offer that I think there have been a number of articles. I will try to also put them in the chat about the sort of fleeting nature of civilian oversight having success. And I think in part that is there are structural critiques, right, about what actual legal power civilian oversight is given. For example, does it have subpoena power, right? Do the boards have the most possible robust protections in terms of what they can do on their own versus having to kind of make recommendations and then allow other executives with discretionary decision making, like mayors or city councils, to actually carry out those orders, and those entities may be more susceptible to political influence in particular ways and less independent. So I think there may be helpful things to look at on that front. I think a couple of groups that come to mind that produce those kinds of resources are Critical Resistance and the Community Justice Exchange often are putting out things like that. So I would look there, but I'll try to drop in the chat those particular resources I'm thinking of.
I was able to just like click through another screen and it actually was right there. So I hope this link works. Maybe it didn't come up as a hyperlink, but you can probably figure it out. Hopefully that one works. It's at Interrupting Criminalization.
Yeah, another phenomenal a group that puts out those kinds of resources. So thank you for the question. The next anonymous attendee asks, what is your view regarding models like in El Salvador that have been successful in bringing down violence and murder rates? And before you answer, I'm just going to offer that we did speak about this extensively with a couple of weeks ago, and that video will be posted soon. Probably within the month is my guess. We take a minute to post these because we edit the captions to make sure they're accurate. But I want to offer that to you, Stuart, of kind of in a regime like we've seen under Bukele, where there has been a dramatic reduction in violence, but also a dramatic expansion of carceralism and fear and a lack of due process. Kind of what does that look like?
Well, look, I mean, I think that there have been a number of police officials. I think in my new book, I have a quote, which I believe is from Ray Kelly, if I'm not mistaken, but maybe not. It's some police commissioner type from New York who basically says something like, "Look, of course it's not impossible to eradicate crime. We could get rid of all crime. The question is just like, do we want to have, any sort of civil liberties or freedom? And so the point being, I mean, I don't know that I agree with him, but there is this attitude among police, which is like, if we didn't have to adhere to certain types of rights protections, constitutional controls, etc., we would be able to get rid of the quote unquote crime problem, and that logic is sort of animating Bukele's dictatorship. And I would just say maybe two key points. Like, one is that the violence that beset El Salvador over the past couple of decades is violence that was, on the one hand, a kind of outgrowth of the Civil War that the United States played a key role in manufacturing, and then also the gangs that were engaging in street violence were exported from U.S. prisons. So that's the first point, is that the United States has a key role in the kind of instability and crime problem in El Salvador in the first place. Bukele comes along and engages in, and absolutely, it is certainly true that he has a certain level of popularity because of his, quote unquote solution to the street violence problem. But, I think it's not dissimilar from the United States insofar as when we take violence from the street and put it behind prison walls, and have it becomes a type of violence that doesn't get recorded in crime statistics anymore, and it doesn't get felt in kind of quotidian life in the public sphere. But the violence is still occurring, and I don't think anybody has any question about the dramatic, intense forms of violence that are happening in these horrific prisons in El Salvador. There is still violence. People are still dying. Um, we've relocated where it happens, and that is certainly true with the prison system in the United States. And I think that we would, if we want to think, critically about the relationship between street violence and incarceration, we should think of incarceration as relocating or redistributing where violence occurs and who and under what circumstances it is being perpetrated, but it's not being eliminated. And I think that as soon as we kind of let go of the idea that violence has ceased to occur once it's no longer being recorded in street crime rates, because now it's happening behind prison walls. Once we let go of that idea, then I think we have a somewhat better analysis of what's going on.
Thank you for that. We've got one more question and then we're gonna wrap up. Ken, I'm gonna allow you to unmute and ask your question.
Hey, Stuart, lovely to see you. And Kay, wonderful job with this series. Yeah, reflecting on the folks from years back when Marcel LeBron, yourself, and others were really exposing how the colonial project, the global colonial project of the West, was bringing counterinsurgency methods home and exporting like that form of barbarism. Reflecting on that moment in time, thinking of like the Freddie Gray uprising, etc. Fast forward to now, what to you would be like the biggest shock that you had not foreseen? I think like when as a member of the National Lawyers Guild, we're having a lot of conversations of like, oh my God, this is happening so fast.
Yeah.
And what is the right response? And you, as someone who has a lot of contact with social movements and as a scholar, I'd be really interested in your opinion of like, or your sentiment of what is the biggest shock in the current moment to you?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, when several of us were engaging in this work, I finished my dissertation in 2015. Really, I think to be honest, I think I sent it off to my committee the weekend that Freddie Gray was killed. So it was very much in that context of the kind of 2014, 2015 Black Lives Matter mobilization that I finished this work. And I wouldn't say that I was directly responding because I started the work much earlier, but I did feel at the time that there was insufficient consideration of the role of empire, and I think Marisol LeBron would say the same thing. In the way that these debates about policing were unfolding. Fast forward to 2020, my book came out in 2019. I think when many of us, were going to protests and rallies in 2020, we observed that people were much more aware and explicit about the linkages to empire and foreign policy. And so the conversation had changed in those kind of 5 years. I'm not taking credit for that. It wasn't because of me. It was a larger shift in kind of political consciousness among people engaged in activism and so forth. So then, we fast forward another 5 years, and I think now, these types of analyses have become, much more widespread. There's a lot more work happening in this vein. But at the same time, like you suggest, I don't think we should sort of like rest on our laurels. Like, I don't think that because I wrote about the Office of Public Safety in the 1960s, which was kind of at the cutting edge of reconfiguring U.S. empire and the national security project, I don't think that means that I have, you know, ICE and CBP figured out. The state is continuing to mutate. It's going in, somewhat surprising directions. I do think that some of the work that I've been doing around the political projects that police have been engaging in for decades, I think is useful for helping to understand what's going on right now in some of these cities and which cities are chosen. I mean, one thing I talked about this a little bit on an episode of the Dig podcast, but in DC, the head of the police union in DC was very much in favor of the federal intervention, in part because he sees the local city council, like elected officials on the city council, as his enemy. And he found the federal intervention to be a way to kind of override the power of the democratically elected city council members. So, there's more to the story, but it's just suffice it to say that I think we can look to history, but I don't think history explains everything that's happening. I do find myself astonished, like every 6 hours when I look at the news, and I think we can see patterns, we can see some precedents, but it is true that things are moving quite quickly, and changing rapidly. And um, I don't want to discount the obviously, as a historian, I don't want to discount the value of historical analysis. Um, but I really reject, I think there's this kind of complacent sort of like pat response, which is just like, oh, there's nothing new under the sun. Like every form of state violence and authoritarianism has already been tried. And like in some ways, I wish that were true, but actually, I think there's a lot of inventiveness occurring under the current Trump administration, and we're only whatever 9 or 10 months into a 4-year term. I think there's a lot still to come that is quite worrisome and requires actually like concerted efforts at critical thinking and observation and analysis. We need investigative journalism, we need lawyers, we need activists, we need people being creative in their activism, and maybe a tiny little bit we need historians. But it is a all hands on deck moment to not just make sense of it, but try to restrain what's going on.
Well, with that call to action, I think that's a perfect place for us to wrap up. Thank you very much, Stuart, for your time and your expertise. And I do personally feel, as a lawyer, that having the grounding in history and reading your work was really mind expanding for me. So thank you for that. And yeah, I think we need each other is a nice way to end. So I appreciate that. And we'll be back here next week, everyone, with Julian Go. And look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Take care.